Hello and welcome to the Australian Roundtable podcast. It is Sunday the 9th of November. This is episode 6 of our weekly broadcast live at youtube.com Australian Roundtable from 4pm Australian Eastern Standard Time every Sunday. I'm your host Johnno and I'm pleased to be joined as usual by my co-panellist Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
And we're fortunate to again be joined in the studio by the Silver Fox himself, Lindsay. Good to have you here, mate.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Now, before we get on to the rundown, I have to once again thank the listeners for all of your support. 2 weeks ago, we had 20 subscribers. Last week, we were up to 60. And today, we have more than 120, and it's growing every day. And this is largely due to our listeners spreading the word amongst friends and family. And if each listener introduces just one more listener, we'll be reaching big numbers of people in no time flat. And one final shout out to all of our listeners who have come across from Max Resistance Roundtable. I'll have more to say about Max Resistance later on in the show, but in the meantime, if this is your first visit to the Australian Roundtable, we thank you for joining in and we offer you a warm welcome from sunny Brisbane. Now, we've got a lot to talk about today, fellas, so we have to get straight into it. But before we do a quick rundown, we'll discuss the Courier Mail and some more nonsense that we've seen from them this week. We'll get on to the anti-protest laws in Tasmania. Then we'll move on to the discussion about a potential Homeland security organisation here in Australia. And then we'll touch quickly on Australia deporting pickup artists, which happened this week. And then we'll have a big discussion on G20 because, of course, this is our final episode before the G20 kicks on. Don't know the term there, but before the G20 hits Brisbane...
Kicks off.
Big time, kicks off. That's the one. Thanks, Lindsay. And then we'll move on to our international segment, where we'll discuss in depth the Ukraine crisis as promised, with Putin touching down any day now. And then if we get time, we'll also quickly discuss Alan Greenspan's recent comments about money, legalisation of a certain herb in the US just recently, and an update on what's been happening in Canada. And then, of course, we'll conclude with our final thoughts, but we'll get straight into it because time is of the essence. Now, boys, last week I went through a couple of the Courier Mail's front pages here in Brisbane. Courier Mail is our only newspaper, and of course, last month we had a front page saying revealed Ferrell's crazy plan for mayhem and anarchy, and that was just ridiculous. And then last week we had Swarm and Destroy, a big front page of a futuristic Brisbane with Black Hawks and searchlights and all kinds of nonsense. Now, I know that neither of you, I asked you before the show, neither of you saw the Courier Mail yesterday, did you?
No.
So this is live, guys. We'll check out your response. This was the front page of the Courier Mail yesterday. Now, the listeners can't see this, but the last few times I said I had a front page photo that covered the whole page, and I was probably exaggerating a little bit. This time I'm not exaggerating. This is actually a full front. In fact, the policeman's head, who is on this page, this is such a big picture. He's blocking out half of the title Courier Mail.
Core Mail.
They couldn't make him big enough, and I'll try and chuck up a photo for the listeners at home after the show. But basically, it says, "G'day," with the G being a G20 sign. "City's longest week underway as invasion begins." And of course, they go on to describe the invasion as mostly being a problem with the protesters and the anarchists who they think are going to cause all of the issues. And in the background, you've got photos of cars burning from Toronto and all kinds of mayhem. This is what people in Brisbane had in front of them as they sat down for a coffee and some toast yesterday morning. What do you think?
No, ridiculous. And I've said this before, like, how do editors live with themselves doing this? You know, we obviously know there's a agenda behind it, but that every week it's getting more futuristic and more photoshops being involved. Add more flames. Invasion begins. Lindsay, I know you're a big fan of the Murdoch campfire. What do you think of this?
Actually, the one thing I did notice about it is that at least that man had an insignia on his uniform. Whereas up until now we've been worried that nobody had anything on them. We didn't know who they were. They could have been from anywhere. But no, that's unbelievable stuff, isn't it? That's the sort of thing you see in war zones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's got the big plastic guard,
shield and whatever.
What looks like a bulletproof vest over his chest. He's got the communications device, shoulder pads, a balaclava, a big helmet. I mean, this guy, you wouldn't want to mess with just one of them. If there's going to be 6,000 of these guys, they could take over the country.
Yeah, and it almost looks like an Islamic female attire. All you can see is his eyes.
I dare you to say that to him when you go to the protests.
No, it's true though. Look.
Yeah. So anyway, look, I've got a funny feeling that each show we're going to start with some nonsense from the Courier Mail because they're just
It's so open to it.
a laughter factory.
Weekly entertainment.
That's it. But we've got to press on now. I wanted to discuss quickly the Tasmanian Anti-Protest laws, and I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can. Now, the background to this is that Tasmania, for our international listeners, is the smallest of our 6 states. It has a population of about 500,000. And it's the most southern state here in Australia. It's just below Victoria. It has a Liberal-controlled lower house, an independent-controlled upper house. Its biggest aspects of its economy are mining, agriculture and forestry. And it's just a beautiful part of the world. Now, in June of this year, the state government passed through the lower house a bill under which people who disrupt workplaces face $10,000 on-the-spot fines with 3-month mandatory jail sentences for repeat offenders. And this, of course, was directed mostly at the protesters who try and stop logging from going ahead. Because there's lots of old-growth forest down there in Tasmania. The protesters try and stop it by chaining themselves to trees. This law basically said that if you do that, you can cop a $10,000 on-the-spot fine. And if you do it again, 3 months mandatory jail. Yeah. I mean, just let that sink in for a moment. Now, in September of this year, a UN law expert said that the laws should be dumped because they went against so many civil liberties that most developed nations think should be part of living in that country. Now, on Thursday of the week just passed, the upper house of Tasmania made some amendments to the bill. And I'll quote from an article from the ABC. And again, with all of the information that we present today, as always, it'll be available in the info box underneath the video on YouTube to check for yourself. And if anybody has any questions about the information we provide, just ask a question. We'll get to it as soon as we can. But this is from the ABC. Quote, protesters who disrupt workplaces in Tasmania will no longer face mandatory jail under legislation changes approved by Tasmania's upper house. The Legislative Council, which is the upper house, voted to scrap the measure, which was a major plank of the government's anti-protest bill. Maximum jail terms were extended from 2 to 4 years, but courts were left with discretion. The maximum penalty for repeat protesters has doubled to 4 years jail. Resources Minister Paul Harris described the bill's passage as a historic moment in the history of worker rights. He was disappointed mandatory sentences were removed, but the doubling of maximum penalties for repeat offenders from 2 to 4 years would send a strong message. End quote. So in other words, the upper house, whose job is to review legislation and hopefully moderate it when it's ridiculous, have kind of done that. Sanity has prevailed here, Lindsay. There will no longer be a minimum length of imprisonment for people who are engaging in non-violent protest. They've just doubled the maximum length of imprisonment for people engaging in non-violent protest. Ethan, what do you think of this?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I linked to an article from The Guardian on my website talking about with these anti-protest laws in Tasmania. A United Nations report concluded that they violate human rights, that they're in violation of human rights down here in Australia. But it just seems like they've just took one and they've repackaged it within another form, as they seem to always do. And it's just, it all follows a pattern. It all follows a pattern where Australia is just heading down a road of our civil liberties being taken away and our right to protest.
Yeah, we've got a long history of this, though, where they take the bits they want out of United Nations agreements and then they ditch the rest. So anything that goes against us, they ditch, but anything they want to shove down our throat, oh yes, we've got to follow that.
Yeah, and obviously I'm not the biggest fan of the United Nations, and we'll discuss that in other episodes, but when our laws are even worse than what the UN says is okay, you've got some problems. And later in the show, we're going to discuss G20 and, of course, the Ukraine incident. And the topic of protests will come, and democracy and this thing will come up more. But the reason I want to bring this up now is just so people are aware. Here in Tasmania, not here in Tasmania, in Australia, Tasmania, one of our 6 states, has passed laws which will allow them to imprison people engaging in non-violent protest to save old-growth forests or whatever it is that those people down there are trying to save, imprison them for up to 4 years, and to fine them on the spot thousands of dollars. Just keep that in mind for when we get to later segments in the show where we discuss other countries and the attacks that they've made, so-called attacks that they've made on freedom of speech. Now, we have to move on quickly. Ethan, I know you've got some stuff to talk about in regards to the Homeland security discussion taking place in this country.
Yeah, well, I'll just touch briefly on it because we've got a couple of big feature segments today, but I was browsing through the news as I do, and I saw on the mainstream press this week that it's announced that they're going to put together a Homeland security type-ish sort of collaborative effort between a lot of organisations, which will be headed by the Australian Federal Police, which will be put in charge of national security if a plan proposed by the federal government is adopted. This is according to the reports that were released. And within the article, News Corp reports that the Prime Minister's office plans to group the Australian Federal Police and its counter-terrorism arms under a single branch, which would also include Customs, Immigration, Border Protection, the Australian Crime Commission, Emergency Management, and the Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre. Now, I know that I'm not the biggest fan of Homeland Security in the United States, and we've seen what happens when we talk about at airports, airport security, and all of these organisations. Here in Australia, it seems like now these are coming together under one, and it's going to be branded as our own Homeland Security. And this is interesting when you relate to how the current environment in Australia, with anti-terrorism laws, with Foreign Fighters Bill being passed, with all of this, it's just ironic how now, hey, a Homeland Security is going to be introduced in this country. What do you think?
Yeah. No, well, I think last time I was talking about, I went to my federal politician about this, and they promised to get back to me in, 3 weeks, a month, and they still haven't got back to me. I suspect that the reason they don't get back to me is because they're all part of this. And it reminded me of the US Homeland Security, where none of them even saw the bill when they just voted on it. And it's almost as if that's what's happening in Australia as well. They just got to toe the line or else.
Am I right in recalling that the American Department of Homeland Security was created just after 9/11? Is that? I'm pretty sure that's when these was.
I do believe that's the case.
Look, if memory serves me right, that's what happened. So it took for 9/11, this big act of terrorism. The specific details, which we can go into another episode, but for the point of argument, 3,000 people died. These massive attacks on New York. It took this massive event to create the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. What did it take for this to happen in Australia? Like one guy allegedly trying to attack a couple of police, and now we've got discussions of a Department of Homeland Security. I mean, we could talk about this all episode, but this is really getting, like, it was already ridiculous, but this is getting beyond joke now. This is incredible stuff.
And the Australian Federal Police were involved in those so-called terror raids which built it up, and now they're going to be put in charge of national security in the country. It's just unbelievable.
It's probably worth, I'll just recap what I remember from those terror raids, because so much has happened in the last few weeks, but basically 600 or 700 officers raid dozens of houses across Australia. 2 guys get charged. One of them, not on terror-related offences, is charged with possessing 4 bullets and a taser. The other guy who's charged, apparently the best evidence that I've found against him that has been reported in the media is that he received a phone call where the guy on the other end suggested beheading people. That's the evidence against him. Now, even if you pretend that actually happened, that some guy suggested that he should behead someone, even if you pretend that guy was involved in the terrorism-related offences, 600 or 700 or 800 officers raiding dozens of houses, massive mainstream media press coverage of the whole thing, and then what happens a few weeks later? What doesn't get reported so clearly by mainstream media? 2 dudes charged, one guy for a few bullets and a taser, the other guy for receiving a phone call. I mean, this is crazy stuff.
Yeah. But it's no different to ACDT drummer the other day.
Yeah,
that was a pathetic. No.
That one's not on the rundown, Lindsay.
No, but it just reminded me. I thought,
we'll discuss. I know you're a huge fan of ACDT. We'll discuss that one on a future episode, Lindsay. Ethan, have you got more to add on this Department of Homeland Security for Australia bit?
No, I just wanted to point out that it's just unbelievable how this is happening, and how it's just so ironic that it's coming at this perfect time. Just when everything is happening, when the G20 is coming to Australia, when all of this is happening, now Homeland Security are going to be touching down on our shores, and I hope I don't have any plastic swords within my house to be put on the media.
No.
Ethan, obviously, from the Alanis Morissette school of ironic. This isn't ironic. This is clearly all pre-planned, and it's a shame that we don't have more time to discuss that today. But we do have to press on. Now, I wanted to quickly touch on this issue of the pickup artist who was deported. Now, let me just quickly give the background to this one. I've got my notes here. Last week on the show, and again on the Max Resistance Roundtable where I was a guest, and I'll talk about that later, I expelled the virtues, Lindsay, of understanding herd behaviour and psychological studies on the topic of herd behaviour, such as the Ash experiments. And I said that having this understanding would keep us from getting frustrated with or losing faith in our fellow humans. And never before has it been so necessary for me to take my own advice, Lindsay, after this week. Basically, here's what happened with this pickup artist. He's from the US. His name is Julian Blunk. and he offers seminars to men looking to improve their game, to use their terminology, and he was scheduled to do a brief tour of Australia's east coast. Media uproar erupted when the MSM, the mainstream media, printed stories about this guy supposedly encouraging his followers to be aggressive with girls, and even in the clubs, put his finger up to their fingers and put his hand to their neck and, I don't know, be a little bit raunchy. Look, I'm not sure exactly, but he did not say that anyone should commit harm against anyone or anything like that. He wasn't even accused by the media of doing that. Some of the people who latched onto the media articles accused him of that. Now, basically, the media uproar erupted and the mindless masses became riotous, and even some of them demanded that he be deported, as the moronic masses tend to do. Now, at this point in the story, things aren't so different from your typical media beat-up. An easy target was scapegoated with emotional rhetoric by the mainstream media, looking to sensationalise, as is their wont, and the mindless masses began to froth at the mouth, like the Pavlovian dogs that so many of them are. One of his seminar venues had to be changed, and then the new venue was accosted by protesters who are alleged to have assaulted one of Blanc's assistants. Because the mindless masses are nothing if not hypocritical, Lindsay. You know this. You've had to put up with them for longer than I've been alive. Now, at this point, still, it's pretty much business as usual. Until just the other day when our Attorney General, George Brandis, announced that Blanc's visa had been cancelled and he was essentially being deported. Now, this is from The Guardian. I'll link to this in the info box. Quote, "The Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, said Blanc's visa was cancelled Thursday night. The matter was raised with us, and we had it investigated, and this fellow looked at," Morrison told Sky News on Friday. "This guy wasn't putting forward political ideas. He was putting forward abuse that was derogatory to women, and that's just something, those are values abhorred in this country," end quote. Now, that was Scott Morrison. I'm confused whether it was Morrison, the Immigration Minister, or the George Brandis, the Attorney General, who was ultimately responsible for this, but either way, Blanc was essentially deported. Now, this guy wasn't breaking any laws. He has essentially been deported for offending people. And this is very dangerous territory. Jokes aside, this is just... you can either laugh or cry, Lindsay. He's been deported for offending people. And the faux left, as I call them, have led the charge to essentially empower their own arch-enemies, Morrison and Brandis. The classic mainstream media and government problem, reaction, solution, which we discussed a couple of episodes ago, has happened once again. And our implied right to free speech and assembly has been even further eroded. And the whole charge has been led by the faux left. It's just so predictable. I even saw on social media people arguing against our rights to free speech and assembly because they wanted the guy deported. So they'll sooner argue against their own rights than concede that maybe someone they don't agree with shouldn't be deported from the country. Some people will even say this isn't about free speech or assembly, but it's about immigration. And technically that is correct, but I think that's missing the bigger picture here. The mere act of having offensive views is enough to get the mainstream media, the moronic masses, against somebody, and that's enough to have the Immigration Minister or the Attorney General essentially deport you. I mean, this is incredible stuff. What do you reckon, Lindsay?
Yeah. No, I agree. And this Brandis, the Attorney General, he was the one only a couple of weeks ago was going to open this all up so that people couldn't be charged or have anything done against them for their opinions. And then he went back on that under pressure from various groups. So, this is sort of the nth degree. It's almost like swinging from one side to the other. I wouldn't trust anything he said.
Yeah. And we spoke off air. Obviously, we're not... I'm not the biggest fan of people that do this. I'm sure many people aren't. But there are a lot of people that do go see him. But it's not the point about... It's about looking behind what has actually happened. Is that someone with a different opinion, someone that has different ideological beliefs, has been cancelled a visa because of his beliefs, which is exactly what we've been talking about. And here's a prime example of how someone who has different beliefs from the masses all of a sudden has all of this taken out against him when he should realistically have the right. And if he is breaking any laws with this, we have laws in this country. Yeah. We have, there's international laws. There's laws that can deal with this if he's doing any of that, which I've only been told by the mainstream media about this. Yeah. So people need to just look past and see, hang on a minute, this has to do with free speech, and that's really concerning in the end.
Yeah, and I probably should have said at the outset of that little piece that I'm not a Blanc supporter. He was supposed to come to Brisbane before he got deported. I didn't even know he was coming, and if I did, I wouldn't have gone for free, let alone if you gave me a ticket. I'm not a fan of his. I'm not a fan of the pickup artist movement. And maybe one day in the future I'll do a big piece on that, because it is an interesting little subset of what is a greater attempt to, I think, destroy our society by pitting men against women. The thing is, that's exactly what's happened here. Yeah. The mainstream media pitted a whole bunch of people who would call themselves feminists against this guy. They went and protested and attacked and got a petition together to get this guy deported, essentially because they don't agree with his views on the relationship between men and women. Well, guess what? I don't agree with most people's views on the relationship between men and women. I especially don't agree with the views of people in the social science and arts faculties of most of our universities and their views on the relationship between men and women. But I would never, ever call for them to be deported because I don't agree with their views. You know what I'd do? I just wouldn't go to their seminars.
That's right.
It's very simple. And when you use this as an excuse to deport people, what next? Because most people listening to this show and most people who can think for themselves are going to hold views that are controversial to some other people. Now, so long as you're not breaking any laws, you're not harming anybody, why should your views be an excuse to get you imprisoned or deported? Well, any sensible person will say it shouldn't be. And that's the great issue and why I wanted to bring this up today. This isn't about common sense. This is about whipping people up into a frenzy. And the thing is, today it's Julian Blanc and his bunch of pickup artists paying hundreds of dollars to be taught essentially how to talk to women, which is a skill that really should be passed down. You shouldn't have to pay money for that skill. Yeah. But essentially, they've got the mainstream media attacking this guy and whipping the masses into a frenzy against this guy. Today it's the pickup artists. Who will it be tomorrow? Because if you have any views of your own, which any thinking person should, it could be your views that are in the firing line next. Now, that's what I wanted to say about Julian Blanc and the pickup artist deportation. Let's get on now to the big topic of today that I've been looking forward to for a while. I know that you have, Ethan, because even in the background, hopefully this isn't coming across in the recording, there is a chopper in the background. Yeah. It may or may not be a military chopper. We'll know soon if it gets any closer. It's G20 time, boys. The G20 is here. And Ethan, you've got heaps of information to share with us and with the audience about it.
Yes, well, while we deny people entering our country, just as that, look who we're letting in now. But yeah, I did want to spend a lot of time to talk about this because it is one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest things that has happened in Brisbane that I can ever recall during my news coverage and whatnot. And I really wanted to break down the G20 and what to expect from the G20, some of the laws, some of the things that have been introduced under these laws, what is being planned in reaction. I really want to chat about the entire G20 circle and then have some discussions amongst ourselves about what we can expect, our opinions on some of it. But I really want to get straight into it. For those who don't know, obviously the G20 Summit is a meeting of the 20 largest economies in the world, and they come together once a year to apparently discuss politics, economies, and a whole range of other issues that supposedly to benefit us as a people. So it was announced, just about 2 years ago that the G20 Summit was coming to Brisbane in 2014. So we've had a significant amount of time to get a basic idea about what we can expect. But really, most of the new information has only just come out recently. It's only just been revealed, some of the later stages of these legislative pieces. So shortly after it was announced, the G20 Safety and Security Bill 2013 was introduced, which set unprecedented police powers for Queensland Police within what is being called an exclusion zone at the start. Now it's called a security zone. The laws were quickly established to dictate what is going to happen underneath these laws. But I'll get into that in a sec. Some of the brief statistics that have come out about the G20, about what to expect. There's going to be upwards of 6,000 security troops. Some say 7,000. It's a big number. There's going to be a lot of security here, and we're already seeing it starting to roll out in Brisbane at the moment. 4,000 delegates are going to be here. An ocean liner. There's going to be an ocean liner. 12 sniper teams are going to be within the city on buildings. So 12 teams of snipers, not just 12 snipers, 12 teams of snipers. 5,000 protesters expected. Some travelling internationally, I don't know. A lot are going to be here domestically, travelling from other states. And $370 million was the estimated cost for the G20 Summit, but when you add on a lot of the other expenditure, it's gone way above that we're, as taxpayers, are paying. So soon, once all of this was announced, they announced that drones were going to be introduced to surveil for crime prevention in the lead up to the G20. They then announced that strip searches would be happening. They have the potential to happen under these laws, under some of the discussions that they had. They introduced these special search laws, but I'll get into that. A number of forums were discussed about the use of independent legal observers, civil liberties, and much more was held as the G20 was announced it's coming to Brisbane. So we do have two zones. A declared area is accessible by all members of the public. So there's a declared area which takes up most of the city, goes back up to Spring Hill. It's the exclusion zone, and thankfully we're just outside of it at the moment. But there's two different zones within this exclusion zone. So the declared area is where all members of the public can go, which is you can just roam the city. It's just that these laws do apply, but a restricted area is closed access areas which are marked by barriers, and you can only go in there if you're a personnel with a badge and whatnot. And some of these restriction zones include, of course, the Convention and Exhibition Centre, which has been fenced off as of yesterday. And Johnno, there was some developments that just happened yesterday. It was introduced with people trying to take photos.
Yeah, look, I haven't got the article in front of me, but I think last night a person in his 50s was arrested. Apparently he was taking photos near the exclusion zone, near the Brisbane Convention Centre. And he was arrested allegedly for not supplying his details to the police. But what had he been doing for them to ask him about his details? Apparently just taking photos. That was all the information that I had, but I haven't got the article in front of me, so I can't say more. But the point is, the first arrest pertaining to the G20 happened last night, well before any of the real fun kicks off in earnest.
Yeah, well, I didn't have much details itself, but it's just an example. It's a precedent of how easy it is for people to be arrested during the G20 Summit before it even kicks off. These restricted zones have just been set up. They've just been put into play as of yesterday. These laws are now in effect, and someone taking photos apparently has just been arrested for not supplying his details to the police when he was just taking photos of the convention centre. So there's already been arrests, and I hope I'm wrong, but as history has shown, there should be a lot more on the way.
Well, if they're trying to break records, it's one down, 1,199 to go. Is that it? Was it 1,100 in Toronto?
Yeah, you've got it all wrong, because the lady in charge, the police lady in charge, was on. There was a big special feature in the Courier Mail yesterday morning.
You're not talking about the front page, are you, Lindsay?
No. This is inside.
We've seen that special feature.
No, this is inside in a little bulletin goes with it, and she was saying we don't want to arrest anybody. That was the whole point. We don't.
Yeah. They've sort of been, over the past, since it's been announced, they've been flip-flopping between. Yeah. There's been news reports saying the police have been told to expect a minimum 1,000 arrests to prepare for it. Then they've come out and said, no, we want to uphold civil liberties and have legal observers to make sure that these arrests don't happen. And it's just, it's hard to, piece together what's actually the motive.
Sorry if I'm preempting something that you're about to say, but do we know yet where these arrestees, if there are hundreds of arrested people, do we actually know yet where they're being taken?
No, I haven't found any information to know where they have been taken.
Because I've tried to look into this, and I've been mixing with different people who are planning to protest and cover the protest and network as much as I can prior to the event. And I've been asking people, do you guys know where arrested people get taken? And some people have said, I don't know. Some people have said, I do know, but those people all give different answers. I'm yet to actually get a solid answer. And I noticed that the Brisbane, the big rectangular stadium in Brisbane called Suncorp Stadium, which hosts soccer matches and rugby matches, it's a world-class stadium, Suncorp. I've noticed that is just inside the exclusion zone. And of course, in Toronto, people who were arrested were taken to a massive film studio, which had been converted into a number of high-volume detainee cells. We could basically put a dozen or 24 detainees in the cell together, have a couple of police watch over them, and in that way have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in detention at the same time. That's what they did in Toronto a few years ago. Yeah. But I'm yet to learn what they're doing here. Now, I'm not saying they are using Suncorp, but that wouldn't surprise me at all, because
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I got a little pamphlet in the mail, and it had a road just near Suncorp that they were going to do car searches and things. And I was trying to work out how you get from there into the centre of the city or whatever, but no, that's probably what it is. And they had the army, they were a big deal about how they were looking under cars and the whole bit.
Yeah, and I was never good enough at soccer or rugby to make the Australian team. This could might be my first chance to get on the turf at Suncorp. What do you reckon, Lindsay?
Oh, yeah, no, I did that when I was a kid. I played on. I won't go on with that anymore.
Yeah.
You're like a father figure to me, Lindsay. I hope that if I get there, you'll come and watch me from the stands.
Lindsay with these signs. We'll move on.
Yep.
So we've gone part. So the basic rundown is the G20 was announced, the laws were introduced, and some of these actions have already started to be taken. I'll just get into some of the laws now, because it's really important to not just activists that are going out there, not just people that are planning, media personnel that are going to be there. It's everyday citizens that are going to be walking through the city that may not have any idea about these laws and what it could, how it could affect them. And so I'll just go through that because it's really interesting stuff when you actually look into the laws when they were first introduced and what's transpired since then. Under the G20 laws, it is an offence to disrupt, interfere with, delay or obstruct the conduct of any part of the G20 meeting or an activity associated with the G20. Interfere with the reasonable enjoyment of any part of the G20 meeting, be inside the restricted area without an appropriate access pass, and possess a prohibited item in the declared area without reasonable excuse, fail to comply with police direction. So the police searching and questioning powers is where it comes in. So that's what it is an offence to do, those three things, to interrupt and to disrupt, and some of the general basic things that you would expect. The police search and questioning powers is what has got civil liberties groups really concerned with some of the draconian type laws and that have been enforced. The police have the power to search any person in the declared area, any person attempting to enter, about to enter, or attempting to leave the declared area. The police have the power to conduct various types of searches, including X-ray scans, electronic scanning, or a walk-through detector. They have the power to conduct searches of any person's belongings, including a bag or mobile phone. They can require you to remove the outer clothing items such as headwear, jackets, or footwear which may be searched. And there's more invasive search that the police can do if they suspect a person is in possession of an item without a lawful excuse, which I'll get into, and a person that is prohibited or excluded from the exclusion zone. And these are under Clause 20, 21, and 23 of the bill. There's a basic search, a frisk search, which speak for themselves, and then there's a specific search under Clause 23, which is a search of all clothing worn by the person, including a strip search on the spot of the person and or medical x-ray of the person, which has, raised a lot of concerns because you can see that it is an offence to just have some of these prohibited items, which some citizens may not even know that they're carrying. I'll read a list of what they are momentarily, but it seems that there's a vague definition of what you can be offended for and what the police can suspect you of, and just a complete civil violation. The police have the power to ask for your name, address, and date of birth. They have the right to ask you to produce ID and the right to ask you why you're in the declared area under these new laws. So if the police ask you that, you are required to answer that under these laws. And it is an offence to disobey or not comply with any of these requests by the police. So if you refuse, or if you even try to question, it can be taken as an offence and you can just be arrested there on the spot. And this is important because of the Toronto summits that we can relate to about how citizens are trying to exercise their rights and police saying you need to do this, you need to do that, and just being arrested. And I know you mentioned last week on the show, Lindsay, that your civil liberties, you've noticed, have diminished over your lifetime as it's progressed through. How would you feel about getting strip searched potentially for being in the declared area, even if you're not at the protest?
Yeah, well, this mob have got form already, this Queensland Police Service. I had a run-in a long time ago, and I followed them through all the way up to the Deputy Commissioner. And in the end, I had to do a freedom of information, and I got their legal advice to them, telling them that they couldn't ask for identification on the street.
Yeah.
But then 2 weeks later, there was an article in the Courier Mail, of all things, of police on horseback demanding identification from young kids on the beach up at Noosa. So they're crooks right from the word go. So now, this, to me, I'm not surprised that they do this sort of thing. If they can think they can get away with this, what worries me is, are they going to try and hang on to this after the G20? That's my big thing.
And that's where we can get into a discussion after I just go through the
Yeah.
basic rundown. But it just seems like it's a really extreme measure just for something as little as maybe holding some of these prohibited items, which I'll go through, which, you know, we could have a laugh about, but this is exactly what is under the G20 law. A wide range of objects are deemed prohibited items, including knives, glass bottles, jars, metal cans and tins, egg reel and replica firearms and weapons, so toy guns, graffiti instruments, two-way radios and loud hailers, air horns, marine warning devices, any device emitting smoke, any device that doesn't matter, laser pointers, any object capable of being used to construct a stage, remote control devices, kites. Kites are not allowed, so if you're out flying a kite that day, then
You're gone.
balaclavas, face masks, and face paints, other than religious items, which could conceal your identity, and fake security accreditation. You can only take a prohibited item into a security area with a lawful excuse. An example of a lawful excuse is a family using knives to consume food at a barbecue at South Bank Parkland. So if you're holding a knife, you can say, well, we're having a barbecue here. But one of the things that were under it was reptiles. You're not allowed to have reptiles in the city. And it just seems that this is just, I understand that they have a job to do and there needs to be precautions, but this is just going way over the top. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a shame they didn't announce the ban on reptiles until relatively late, because they foiled this plan that I've been working on for 2 years. All of those reptiles are...
Have they done spiders or anything like that, or not? Or they haven't got down to it? No, where does it end? Where does it end?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But if you've got your pet turtles and you're planning to overthrow, you better watch out, because turtles are going to be...
One of the things you mentioned was that we're banned from taking devices that could be used to create a stage, and I just want people to keep that in mind for later in the show when I discuss some things to do with Eastern Ukraine. But you mentioned earlier, Ethan, that they've got 12 sniper teams here in Brisbane for the G20, and what I want to know is, how do they arrive at the figure of 12 sniper teams? How do they determine that that was the necessary number of sniper teams to keep us safe? And can you imagine what was happening in the room, the big boardroom where they were discussing this? Was one guy lobbying for 14 and another guy saying, no, I think 10 should be more than enough. We'll reach a compromise at a dozen sniper teams. I mean, how do they even determine we need a dozen teams of snipers? But look, they could be trained on us right now for all we know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No. Well, I heard that they're bringing New Zealanders over as well.
Yep.
Right. So you run through them all. Right. The federal police have got 3 or 4. The army's got a few they can loan. There's a couple from the police. There's a couple from New Zealand, and it just 12. All right, we'll use a lot of them. That's all that.
I think it's important to note that each leader can bring their own security. I think the estimate was up to 800 if they want of their own security personnel. So the Secret Service or whatnot can all be here, and from the reports, they're already here, scoping the city already. So it's interesting to be here as everything. We're still a week out, a week from, just under a week from today, and it's interesting. So I will keep my reptiles locked up, John.
It's worth bearing in mind too, at the Occupy Wall Street protests a few years ago, it was later leaked from the FBI or one of those spaghetti alphabet agencies that one of their plans had been that if the mainstream media bombarded and attacking the protesters didn't disperse them, because that does tend to happen. We're herd animals. If the mainstream media says that these guys are all bad, they're causing problems, they tend to lose public support and it dissipates. Their plan was, if that didn't work, they were going to assassinate the leaders of the protests. And it's instructive for any protesters who plan to go to these protests in Brisbane to bear in mind that at any time they could very well be literally in the firing line of one of these dozen sniper teams.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that intrigued me during the week is that after all the stuff on the front of the paper for a fortnight now, trying to scare hell out of everybody in Brisbane.
Yep.
People have decided we won't go anywhere near this place. And then the Lord Mayor comes out and says, "Oh, this is terrible. We've got to have people there. All our guests will wonder what's going on if it's, the whole area is deserted." So they can't make up their mind whether they want to secure the place or whether they want the public there or they want the public out of it. Nobody seems to know what they want.
I think, again, it's important to note that this applies to anyone that's in the declared zone, whether you're a protester in the heart of the protest or you're going down to the local shop. It appeals to anyone, and the civil liberty groups have said that there's potential that civilians could get just caught up in this, and there could be mass arrests due to that, due to protesters not knowing what's going on, because they have to live in this city. They don't want all of this.
Yeah.
We've talked about there's no reason for these people to be coming and interrupting cities other than to serve their own agenda. So it's troubling. These laws are really troubling.
Yeah, you mentioned how the exclusion zone doesn't yet extend to where we're sitting at the moment. Obviously, we're doing this show from my place in St. Lucia. Of course, it was rumoured during the week that Barack Obama might be giving a speech at the University of Queensland, which is, of course, just down the road from me here in St. Lucia. Now, if that were to happen, I don't think that's been confirmed yet, but if that were to happen, you'd imagine they would just extend the exclusion zone, and next thing you know, the Australian Roundtable is, boom, in the crosshairs, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, under these laws, they do have the ability to search houses within the perimeter zone, and they've got their car checkpoints. They can direct traffic wherever. They can search cars. It's just completely rolling out, just as it's come into effect yesterday. But after you're arrested, so if you're unlucky enough to get arrested for your reptiles, police officers have the power to hold arrested individuals for a length of time, quote, reasonably necessary, unquote, to establish the person's identity, and to do one or more of the following: release them without charge and release on bail, give the person an exclusion notice requiring them to leave the declared area and not return until the end of the G20. And for those out there that are concerned about maybe what your rights are and your responsibilities, we've talked about that everything's been piled against you, that you're losing your rights. The Caxton Legal Centre has released a number of information pieces on your rights and responsibilities during the summit. I'll post them within the description of this video, along with links to the legislation, links to various informational pieces for our people that are interested in that. Some of our people are going to be here in Brisbane, but there has been a collective of protest groups that have come, and I want to get now into the last part, talking about the people's response to this. What are the people going to do that are protesting? And one of the groups is the Brisbane Community Action Network, otherwise known as BrisCan G20, have formed a response to the G20 meeting throughout the whole week. It starts with Visioning Another World, which is the People's Summit, which is a 3-day festival of idea sharing, art, creative activities, education, workshops throughout the city. And that will be from November 12th to 14th. And then on the 15th is when the major People's March is happening. And I know that I'll be there covering it for my website, tottnews.com. And a lot of citizen journalists are going to be there, and we're going to be broadcasting the Australian Roundtable during the summit, talking about what's transpiring over the week. And I'm excited to head out to that with all the negativity with these laws and seeing police everywhere and seeing a pretty draconian Brisbane at the moment. I'm excited to go and talk about, politics, and there's Trans-Pacific Partnership and alternative media and all of these workshops that are happening, to go out and get interviews and whatnot, and to really share common ideas with like-minded people in response to this, and to say, that it's not all bad, that there's going to be a lot of creative effort and a lot of response to this within within the scope of the G20, Lindsay.
Yeah. So people will start to find similar people, similar outlooks, and it'll help to bring people together.
And it's a great time for Australian alternative media, and for some of our international listeners out there who will try to get their information from the Australian mainstream media, which I can just envision what's going to be coming with that, with the Courier Mail. we're providing a hub to talk about what's really happening at these protests, just as citizen media journalists did in Toronto, just as everything has done, and we're going to be here at the front line to report that. So if you want to learn about BrisCan's response, you can go to briscan.net.au/program, which has the timetable of all the programs. If you're in Brisbane, if you want to get involved, there's the Citizen Media Centre. There's also a number of handbooks, activist resources, and more on the BrisCan website, and you can find out information about the Indigenous response to the protests as well. So here we are today, and now the new laws within the security zone are now set up until November 17th. Police have been told, as we've mentioned, to expect minimum of 1,000 arrests. Court will be live streamed to the public 24 hours a day, it was announced, because they're expecting that many protesters. I saw this morning on the ABC that they've announced that sonic cannons will be in play if they need to be used. Sonic cannons, which we have seen at other G20 protests. Obviously, the catalyst with the anarchy anticipated from questionable groups such as the Black Rose Syndicate. Traffic is subjected to reroutes and public transport's heavily disrupted. So, gentlemen, I wanted to just get into a basic discussion about maybe what are your expectations? What do you see this mirroring what happened in Toronto? Do you see police? Engaging in mass arrests, or do you see just everything going along as planned, Lindsay?
I have no expectations. Until I met you fellas, I had no idea what had happened in Toronto and what would happen here. I've had very minimal to do with police, but I remember once on the side of a road talking to a policeman and discussing the fact that I was a man and I had certain rights, and he got very aggro about that. So I'm not sure what we're going to expect from them. I'm sure some of them are reasonable, but some of them really do look upon us as sheep, and they're the cattle dogs or the sheep dogs, and I don't know what to expect from them. I hope they do use some restraint. That's all I can say.
Importing New Zealand police to help watch over the sheep, Lindsay,
would
be a recipe for disaster. I wanted to note before we move on from the topic, which we won't for a while, but I just wanted to point out to the listeners who are wondering, hey, they're the alternative media, they're trying to branch out to the establishment to network with them. I want to say that I did send an email to the G20 asking to get one of their members on as a guest of the show. And so far, no response, Lindsay, but we are trying. Take my word for it.
My expectations is, as you said, I don't know what to expect, because this is the biggest thing that I've been a part of in Brisbane, and all of these leaders that are going to be here, they're all going to be in one place, and the security is starting to ram out. And just seeing Brisbane, how it is becoming fortressed off at the moment, it's something that I haven't expected. And we can look at Toronto, where there was 1,100 people arrested and only 44 charges were laid. 44 out of 1,100 people arrested. It becomes to a point where I don't know what to expect, but we're going to be there on the front lines reporting whatever it is that happens, and I do hope that it goes along peacefully, because there's going to be mass protests on the day, not just BrisCan. There's pro-G20 summits, there's anti-Putin summits, there's over 20 different groups having 40 events as of this Wednesday throughout the city. So it's going to be massive, and it's going to be a roller coaster. I really,
and I'm hoping that those groups don't start into fighting with each other either. That'd be even worse.
Well, at the end of the show, in our final thoughts, we'll discuss the days that we plan to live broadcast about the G20, and we'll get into more discussion about that at time. But can I ask you two right now, especially you, Ethan, do you have any predictions about which day might be the most likely to see uproar and arrests and these kinds of things? Because my own personal opinion is that the Saturday is going to be the key day. I understand that BrisCan and other groups are planning to do a march, which has been okayed supposedly by the Queensland Police, and they're going to go through to Musgrave Park. I see two issues with this. Firstly, in the so-called free speech zones that were made available to the protesters in Toronto, people were still, the police call it corralling. They were corralled into a section, and then mass arrests took place, and allegedly beatings took place. Unfortunately, we don't have any video evidence to verify whether this is or not the case, because the video footage of that happening was confiscated. But allegedly, those protesters who were in the free speech zone were accosted by the police and mass arrests took place. So just because you're following the rules that have been laid down to you doesn't mean you're immune. The second issue is I understand that a number, or at least one, Indigenous group who use Musgrave Park as one of their hubs for protests are planning to stay late and possibly even camp out at Musgrave Park on the Saturday. And if that's their plan, I hope I'm wrong about this, but I can see some really big troubles going down there. I mean, we've seen even before the G20, mass police, not just brutality, but overt aggression in general towards these kinds of Indigenous groups at Musgrave Park in the past. Footage is still available on YouTube. If anyone just wants to Google Musgrave Park Police, you'll see it for yourself. That was before G20 even got here. So what's going to happen now that we've got G20? You're going to have all these other disparate groups protesting at G20 making their way to Musgrave Park. If there's going to be anything terrible go down, I suspect, and I hope I'm wrong, Musgrave Park on Saturday is going to be where it takes place.
I do believe the Saturday will be the major catalyst for, whatever's happening. And, we've shared personal beliefs before, and my personal belief of Australia heading towards a police state. And you mentioned before about what happens if these laws, if they hang on to these laws after it, if they say, well, hang on a minute, look at all the mass arrests that we had to do, look at all the trouble that was caused, maybe we need to keep these laws on in general, and then boom, you're walking down the street getting strip searched, whatever the case may be. I hope I'm wrong, but I do see that this could be the catalyst for something. With the direction that Australia's been heading, I have said on camera before, I do believe that police provocateurs will be here, just as evidence has clearly proved in Toronto that they were there, allowed to smash up buildings, then for the protesters to be the victim of the police brutality. I do believe that they're there because it seems inevitable. All of this media hype, all of these anarchy on this Courier Mail, anarchy, police, the invasion is coming, all of this. What would happen then if we went out and were all peaceful and worked together? It would have devastating effects for the media getting their point across. It would not serve the agenda of the police and the people that are controlled. And it just seems like the G20 in the current landscape of Australia could be the perfect catalyst for something big.
And of course, the G20 will be held again in about 12 months' time. I don't even know who hosts the next G20, but the point is they're also going to roll out thousands of police dressed up in tactical, essentially army gear. How can you justify that? Well, look what happened at the last one. I mean, they need to have agent provocateurs. They've been caught doing it before, and that's why I'm particularly interested in covering the protest. I'm not actually planning to take part in any of the protests myself. I just want to walk down from a safe distance, use the zoom on my camera and just record what happens, because I think we need to do that. And all the listeners at home who are listening to this before the protests, because obviously our episodes are archived, you could be listening to this in a year and nothing happened. I hope that's the case. But if you're listening to this before you go to the protests, please make sure that your camera is fully charged. Make sure that your phone is fully charged so you can use that as a camera. Make sure that as many of us are covering what happens as possible so that if and when these agent provocateurs come around, we can get as much footage of them as possible so that we can say to the next host city the same way that Toronto said to us, hey, look, they do this. The police and other agencies pretend that they are protesters. They do bad things to justify all the police brutality. Let's catch these guys in the act. And that's why they have that unofficial media hub that I think Brisbane is running somewhere near the city. They'll have that one, and good on them for doing that. I'm going to be using my place here in St. Lucia to do the same thing. So if anything does happen at that Brisbane G20, or whoever is hosting that unofficial media hub, if anything does happen, just get in touch with us here at Australian Roundtable. We want to make sure that independent journalists, citizen journalists, anyone who's covering this has somewhere to get together, use the internet, and tell the world what's happening. Because essentially, that's what I'm here for. I'm not here to protest. Look, I've taken part in other protests, but really there's a bigger calling for me here, and I think for us as a group, is to cover what happens to the protesters. Because you know what? A lot of those protesters are involved in protests that I don't think are valid things to complain about. But that's their right, Lindsay. That's their right to do that. Yeah. And who is making sure that those protesters get treated fairly in what is supposed to be a democratic country? Well, it's up to the citizen journalists, isn't it?
No, I agree. And like you're saying, I'm just wondering whether we can form a hub where people send copies of all the videos they have. Because I remember in places in America when things happened, it was the first videos that were the important ones before it was all rewritten or redacted, whatever. And it'd be nice if we had a copy of that. Maybe even be able to do face recognition of some of the provocateurs or whatever, so we know what we're doing.
Yeah, and it is important to discuss this, because we do have to stick together as a community, as citizen journalists. Whether we have, issues or not, whether we disagree with each other or not, some of these, some citizen journalists that I don't get along with, I've said, we can collaborate together. This is about covering what's happening at G20 and covering it because the mainstream media won't. And I'll be covering it on my site, tottnews.com, for a quick plug there. We'll be, our YouTube channel will be, we'll have hopefully have interviews and everything all up, and I just think we're in for one hell of a roller coaster.
Yeah, well, if this gets out to enough people, maybe they'll see us as a lightning rod, and people may well come to that side.
Mm. Yeah, look, I'm hoping that media hub that Brisbane have put together is the lightning rod, as you put it, and we're essentially just a smaller. I'm happy for us to be the small group if there's a bigger group of people doing this. I think it's important, though, that we don't centralise too much, because it makes it that much easier to shut it down if and when that's the decision. And we're not going to give out my address or my phone number here over the show, but if anyone does want to get in touch with Australian Roundtable, just get in touch with either our Gmail account, which is australianroundtable@gmail.com, or through YouTube, youtube.com/Australian Roundtable. If you've got something you want to get out to the world, get in touch with us. If you've got a good story to tell and you want to be on one of our live shows next week, get in touch with us. We'll get you on board. Let's get the truth out to the world, because the world wants to hear it and the stories deserve to be told. In saying that, I want to make this very clear to all of the audience and to you guys here as well. If you're a protester, like a genuine protester, but you think that any kind of violent activity is going to further your cause, you're an idiot. And I, for one, if I'm near these protests and I see anyone, and I don't think they're a provocateur, I just think they're a dumb protester engaging in violent activity, I will be the first one to try and shut them down, because they're going to get us all in trouble. So if you're a real protester of any kind, and for whatever reason you think that engaging in violence or aggression towards the police or towards businesses nearby is a good idea, think again. It's not a good idea. And if I see you, or if any smart protester sees you, you'll be shut down, which is exactly what happened in Toronto. The union organizer, one of the trade union leaders, saw an Asian provocateur, and he was the first one to shut him down. And that's what we have to do as protesters. Mm-hmm. We're here to protest peacefully. We're not here to be aggressive towards the police, who ultimately are just doing their job, whether you like it or not. If the sucker at the front line of the police wasn't doing his job, someone else would be doing it, okay? They're just people. They just happen to be paid to be on the other side. They're not really our enemy. Our enemies are those Asian provocateurs and the people who are behind them. So they're the ones we're out for. Protesters, if you see someone doing something stupid and they're meant to be a protester, you shut them down. Let's make this a peaceful protest. Let's make this the most peaceful protest ever. And if we catch those Asian provocateurs, let's capture them on video.
And I'll point out on air as well that I'm not going to be taking place in any violent activity. I'm not planning to do anything illegal. So everyone out there, just check the info box for PDF files about your rights and responsibilities. Get educated, and let's cover what's actually happening.
Before we move on to the next topic, Lindsay, any final thoughts on G20?
I don't know whether this is important. If you've got more important things to talk about, I'm just referring to the Courier Mail letters to the editor during the week, and there was a man who, and I'll read a bit of it. A man who came out and was against the idea of police or soldiers or anybody behaving in drills in the city without having any insignia on. And then there was a reaction, and it was like the sheep came out bleating afterwards the next day. And now, I know with the Courier Mail, those sheep probably all put in there, and anybody agreed with this fellow was probably kept out.
Yep.
But I'll just read it to you very quickly. It was by a man named Merv Bartlett. I don't know Merv Bartlett. Secret manoeuvres in the dark should frighten all Australian citizens. Now, that was a story on the page 5 on the day before. The reporter refers to a mysterious high-level military operation in the CBD overnight. Accordingly, I am driven to ask, to whom are these heavily armed and battle-dressed persons responsible? An Australian Army officer or the Queensland Police Commissioner? This is bizarre. We have roaming the streets of Brisbane by night two presumably separate law enforcement agencies, one being police of officers, both state and federal, and the other apparently consisting of platoons of soldiers under the command of a lieutenant or higher. This is a recipe for disaster unless there's strict protocol and even stricter coordination between the parties. During World War II, Peter Ustinov reported that the streets of London became the meeting place of officers and soldiers from all over the globe, and that when he walked down the street, he was amazed by the number of salutes being exchanged between men and women in so many varied uniforms. He purchased a large trench coat of khaki colour, bought a pair of knee-length leather black boots and a peaked cap, and everybody saluted him. Journalist Conor O'Brien further described the secretive goings-on in the Brisbane business district and, quote, the group was dressed in olive-coloured military-style clothing with no apparent badges identifying themselves or their agency. Some appeared to be wearing body armour. Personnel on the scene refused to provide any details of the operation or the agencies involved when asked by the Courier Mail, end of quote. Now, no one claims to own these heavily armed people, so any group of men could do a Peter Ustinov and clad themselves in what seems to be military gear. These protective moves on the part of those we entrust with the job of keeping the peace have morphed into a disturbing secrecy. Citizens going about their business in the wonderfully free land of my birth should not be palmed off when inquiring about such clandestine actions as was the case with the Courier Mail. And I won't go any further. The letter goes on. It was quite a long letter. But I see the point. And we had at the APAC meeting in Sydney, the Chaser Group pretended to be Secret Service agency escorting Osama bin Laden to that conference.
The Chaser Group are an Australian Broadcasting Corporation. They used to have a show, a group of guys relatively young who used to do funny things.
Yeah. And this carries out exactly what this man is referring to. Anybody, if they dress up and look the part, can just go about doing whatever they like. Now, what happens if plenty of people in Brisbane get shot? Who do we go to? All we see is a man in a green uniform or a khaki uniform. Who do we go to? We've got no way of identifying these people. And like we said with that picture there, it looks like a Muslim woman where only thing you can see is the eyes.
Yeah.
So how do you identify any of these people?
Yeah, well, that's one thing I missed to say is that there was articles saying that police, even police as well, don't have to wear their name tags during the G20 Summit, so we can't even ask who they are. So that's a perfect example.
Yeah. In the interest of full disclosure, Lindsay, that letter to the editor that you just read out verbatim, that wasn't you writing in under a pseudonym, was it?
No. This man, I've seen his name before. I really don't know who he is. He's from Polaro, a suburb of Brisbane. I've seen him write other letters to the editor. But it just triggered with me, and I thought, everything he says is sensible. But then the very next day, there were 4 other letters decrying what a hopeless case he was and how the army and the police are there only just to look after us and our benefits. And I thought, I can't understand the thinking there. There seems to be it's this old thing about if you're prepared to give up your liberty for security, you don't get either, or you lose both of them. And that's the way it seems to me. And obviously it seems like that to Merv Bartlett. But the other people don't seem to care. And I'm astounded by this attitude by so many people.
Well, we mix, Ethan and I probably mix with younger crowds than you do, Lindsay. Do you want to give us an idea and give our listeners an idea, the people who you mix with, who are probably a generation or two above us, have you spoken with these people about their general feelings towards G20 and what have you noticed?
No. My problem is I'm looking after an elderly mother, so I really don't get out with very many people now. I see more of you fellas now than I do of anybody my own generation at the moment. I've got lots of friends from northern New South Wales, and I used to talk to them about these same things. I'll give you a very quick, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll give you an example. When I was a young man, I worked in New Guinea, a 20-year-old, and then I went on my first leave, and I went on one of these voyages, where you go for a trip around the Pacific. And we pulled into American Samoa, and he was a policeman on point duty doing traffic work, and I was sitting on the boat looking down, and he had a gun on his hip, and I was absolutely scandalised by this. Fancy a copper with a gun on his hip doing point duty. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, they all had them here, and now they've got machine guns. It's just it bears out what I'm talking about, the change in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And when I say I was scandalised, I really was. I couldn't believe that the Americans would leave a copper in public with a gun on his hip.
Wow.
And And now look at what we got.
Yeah.
And hopefully somebody who's now 20 or whatever might understand now the degeneration in our civil liberties and just expectations of our servants over that length of time. Just because you see them with machine guns now doesn't mean that's the way it's always been.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and this notion that it hasn't always been this way, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot and discussing with people a lot. because it does become normalised so quickly.
Yeah.
And look, I don't know if this is the reason why, but it almost seems as though the rise in the police state, which is going exponential, is occurring at a time when the distractions available to the average sheeple is going up exponentially. It's never been easy to get distracted or to care more about trivial things. And at the same time, the police state is rising as so many people don't seem to be paying any attention. But even when I was a kid, the police didn't have the kind of weapons that they have now. In fact, I'm pretty sure when I was a kid, the police who had guns just had revolvers, like six bullet compartment. I don't know the technical term for guns. They could hold six bullets. That was a gun. Now they've all got semi-automatic 9mm pistols, and of course for G20 they're carrying around semi-automatic assault rifles. Essentially, that's just in my lifetime, and I'm a young person. So the people who got out of World War II and saw this as the potential for a whole new world of peace and whatever. People like yourself, Lindsay, who were there when things were meant to be okay. I can only imagine what it's like to sit there and watch what's happening today.
Yeah. No. And you think back to, like my mother, for instance, she was born just after the First World War. You imagine the changes that they've seen over a lifetime. Yeah. Anyway, I won't go on about it, but I'm hoping that might get through to some people, just how I viewed that in those days. Yeah.
Oh, look, you could almost have an entire show just dedicated to it hasn't always been this way. And don't think that it has to be this way. I mean, like I said, the United States Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. It didn't exist before that. But now there's a whole... People my age in the United States, half of their lives they've had, and the more important half, like the part they remember the best, there's always been a Department of Homeland Security. It's becoming normalised. It's becoming normalised. And of course, once that gets normal, something more becomes normal, and before you know it, you are living in a police state. Which, look, as we sit here today in beautiful St Lucia, we're only a few kilometres away from what is a police state. However, they've restricted it to a small exclusion zone. The question is, how long does that exclusion zone last, and how normalised does that become for the people, even if they do reduce these police powers after G20? Now we've got a taste for it. You know, like an inoculation. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And is that a precipitation for bringing foreign troops in when they want to bring them in?
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And I know years ago there was a fellow called McLam, who was a police officer from America, who toured Australia trying to drum up support for his organisation, which was against the New World Order or whatever. And that was one of the big points he had in the back of his book, was a program of a chart of what countries troops were going to go into other countries to enforce the UN dictates at the time. I mean, obviously your own soldiers are not going to shoot their own people, or we hope they won't, but you just bring in foreigners. And I'm worried about that's the next step.
And eventually on the show we'll get to discuss what's happening in the US right now, where they're essentially giving amnesty to people who come across the border if they agree to sign up to their armed services. Now, you can easily foresee how that might be taken advantage of. Once you've got your official US soldiers over in Africa fighting Ebola, whatever the hell that means. When you've got your soldiers, they just sent another 1,500 to Iraq, so that's 3,000 now. When you've got your actual personnel, your American citizens are fighting in foreign lands, and all of a sudden you've got this new group of personnel who have no real affinity towards America as people, you can easily see that to be abused. But we don't have time to get too much detail about that today. Anything more to add on to G20 before we move on, boys?
No.
Now, look, we're going to move to the international segment now, and I have put together a very detailed piece on Ukraine, as I've been promising to do for a while. I'm looking forward to discussing this, but it's up to you two. If you're happy to go beyond an hour and a half, we'll cover this. If not, I'll save this for another piece at a future time. Lindsay, you happy to go a bit beyond the normal 90 minutes that we have for a show?
Yeah.
And what about yourself, Ethan? You happy to go beyond the 90 minutes?
Yep.
All right, we'll go beyond 90 minutes, guys. Hope the listeners have time to listen to all of this. Obviously, with the show, once we put it up to YouTube, we put the timestamps there, so you can always just click onto the segments you want to listen to at any given time and go from there. Let's get on to the topic of Ukraine now. Obviously, I've been meaning to do a proper piece on the Ukraine, Russia, Crimea, MH17 saga for some time, but there's just been too much else to cover. And in putting this piece together, it quickly became clear to me that to even give a basic outline of what's been happening would take an entire show. And even then, it'd still be lacking the depth that this topic deserves. So instead, on this piece, part one, I'll simply focus on a few key points that haven't gotten anywhere near enough attention in the mainstream media. And then in part two, I'll cover some other parts that I didn't get time to discuss today. Now, in part one, I'll give a quick background on Ukraine and its democratic institutions, a primer on the 2004 so-called Orange Revolution. Then I'll give a basic recap of the 2010 presidential election and the 2012 parliamentary election. Then I'll move on to the tussle which followed those elections between the East and West for economic agreements with Ukraine. And then I'll get to the fun part, the blatant US attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government. And then the part that's even more fun than that, the anti-protest laws that the previous government enacted and the pro-democracy funding that led to many of the protests. And that's why I wanted to give a particular focus on that part today, is because we look around us and look at what the laws say about us being allowed to protest. Let's compare that to what happened to the ousted President Yanukovych and the laws that he passed that were supposedly anti-democratic. Now, I have to say that the topic of Ukraine and the related issues is so important for a number of reasons. Firstly, Putin touches down. Vladimir Putin touches down here in Brisbane any day now. He could even be here right now. We haven't had time to check the news today. I don't know when he's supposed to arrive. And of course, there's been lots of mainstream media coverage here in Australia about his alleged involvement with the shooting down of the MH17 and Abbott's response. And really, Abbott has just been he's made a fool of himself and he's made a fool of this nation in his response to that. This topic is also important, though, because it goes to the heart of how our government and mainstream media in this country distort the truth and even blatantly fabricate entire stories, especially when it comes to topics like democracy and democratic rights. So let me get straight into it then. The quick background now. Today, Ukraine has a population of about 45 million people, and Russia has about 140 million. So it's the smaller brother, but it's almost twice the size of Australia in terms of population. Of its population in Ukraine, about 78% are ethnically Ukrainian, and about 18% are ethnically Russian. And the two languages are said to be somewhat mutually intelligible, although many people in the country speak both. And all of my figures that I give today from the CIA World Factbook, which I'll link to in the info box under the video. The land area of Ukraine is slightly larger than that of Spain. The political system, which we have to understand for the rest of what's to come, works like this. The president is directly elected by the people for a 5-year term, and then he appoints the prime minister with the consent of parliament, and he represents the nation in international relations, which includes negotiating and signing treaties. The prime minister of Ukraine gains consent of the parliament, and they know their parliament is the Verkhovna Rada, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, by simple majority, and elections are held every few years. So the Ukrainian prime minister is not too dissimilar to our prime minister in Westminster systems, except that their parliament is unicameral and that the president takes over international relations. So they have a president, direct elected, 5-year terms, a prime minister, elections like our own, representative democracy. That's how they work out their electoral system there in Ukraine. And what that means is that'd be like our foreign minister, Julie Bishop, being our president. Could you imagine that? I would take the US puppet government over Julie Bishop almost. Anyway, we'll move on. So in 1991, Ukraine announced its independence from Russia. And in December 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, and Ukraine's independence was now de jure official. Part 2. The 2004 presidential election and the Orange Revolution. Now, in 2004, the presidential election was the country's fourth since independence, and the runoff presidential election was won by Viktor Yanukovych over Viktor Yushchenko. There were claims of vote rigging, which led to reportedly hundreds of thousands of protesters gathering at Independence Square, which we know as Maidan, and a political deadlock ensued. Now, many protesters wore orange, as that was Yushchenko's campaign colour. Hence the term the Orange Revolution. Of course, it was a colour revolution. We'll get to America's colour revolution soon. The Ukraine Supreme Court annulled the results of that election in order to revote, and Yushchenko won the revote with 52% of the vote compared to Yanukovych's 44%. And Yanukovych abided by the new result. Here are some excerpts from an article that was printed in the British Guardian at the time by a guy called Ian Trainer, who today is the European editor of the British Guardian. So this isn't Russian propaganda. This is straight from Britain's press, and this is from 2004. I'm going to read out a large section, but I'll link to the article in the info box. Check out the whole thing. It's fascinating. Again, this is from the from the Guardian back in 2004. Quote, Ukraine, traditionally passive in its politics, has been mobilised by the young democracy activists and will never be the same again. But while the gains of the Orange Revolution are Ukraine's, the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that, in 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavoury regimes. Funded and organised by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties and US non-government organisations, the campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. The operation, engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience, is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. It goes on. The Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the US State Department, and USAID are the main agencies involved in these grassroots campaigns, as well as the Freedom House NGO and billionaire George Soros's Open Society Institute. US pollsters and professional consultants are hired to organise focus groups and use cephalological data to plot strategy. Not too much left here, guys, just bear with me. The usual fractious oppositions have to be united behind a single candidate if there is to be any chance of unseating the regime. Officially, the US government spent $41 million organising and funding the year-long operation to get rid of Milosevic from October 1999. In Ukraine, the figure is said to be around $14 million. And of course, that's in 2004 dollars, and because of inflation, it's much more than that now. Apart from the student movement and the united opposition, the other key element in the democracy template is what is known as parallel vote tabulation, a counter to the election rigging tricks beloved of disreputable regimes. There are professional outside election monitors from bodies such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but the Ukrainian poll, like its predecessors, also featured thousands of local election monitors trained and paid by Western groups. And quote, now that is a long excerpt, thanks for bearing with me there. There's far more in the article. And of course it basically states this was another massive protest against a sitting government that was fomented largely with Western funds. I mean, this is a guy from The Guardian who is to this day the European editor stating clearly this is what happens. I mean, it's not hard for anyone to see, and even the British, even the Western press, at least back then, would report on it. Now, note that this wasn't an anti-US article. In fact, the writer referred to the governments which the US tries to destabilise as anti-democratic and unsavoury, and their elections as rigged. So this wasn't even an anti-US piece. He was actually supporting what they did.
Yeah, saying the way it is.
Exactly. Now, the Washington Post, this is back in 2004, the Washington Post, a couple of weeks later, ran what was essentially a reply to Trainor's article. And I'm going to quickly quote from that article. Again, the link will be in the description box. Quote, "Some have sought to portray the events in Ukraine as orchestrated in the West, a model executed with the support of Western pro-democracy foundations. Such views have been put forward by the Kremlin spin doctors and picked up by commentators in newspapers, such as The Guardian in Britain. But there is no real mystery about how these kinds of revolutions happen." End quote. And then he just basically goes on to confirm all of the methods that Trainor had discussed in how they do this. He pretty much confirmed all of them. I'll pick it up again from later in the article. Quote, "Some commentators believe that the similarity of these methods proves they are part of a US-sponsored plot, an effort to extend American influence throughout the world. Such accusations are now being levelled at the Ukrainian youth group Pora. There's nothing new or Western-inspired about the desire for freedom, and now at last it appears the Ukrainians finally stand on the brink of achieving their age-old dream." End quote. So in this article, the writer didn't even deny US involvement. He just tries to frame the argument as one about freedom and democracy rather than about US intervention. And the writer of that Washington Post article, and I don't have that name with me, I apologise, it'll be in the info box. He actually worked for the United States Aid or the National Endowment for Democracy, one of those two non-government organisations that basically do what the CIA used to do covertly. And I'll get into more detail about that in part 2. But the point I wanted to make here was, hey, even in the West, back in 2004, when Yanukovych was first deposed after being elected, even Western media could see clearly that this was largely fomented by the US. I'll move on to part 3. So that was back in 2004, by the way. Part 3, 2010 presidential election and the 2012 parliamentary election. So it's fair to say that Yushchenko, who was then installed in that second election, things didn't work out so well for him. At the 2010 presidential election, which was the first since 2004, Yanukovych won with 49% of the vote to Yulia Tymoshenko's 45%. And BBC reported at the time that the elections had been conducted fairly and according to international observers. Now, Ukraine uses a 2-round first-past-the-post election system for president. So what that means is you take all the candidates, if no one gets a majority, then you take the 2 most popular and run those 2 off against each other. And this is used in a number of countries, this kind of system. In Ukraine, for the 2010 presidential elections, in the first round, Yushchenko only won 5% of the vote. He came in 5th. So this was the guy who in 2004 lost, but they said there was vote rigging. Then he won the second one. After 6 years of being president, he got 5% of the vote in the first round in 2010, and Yanukovych won in his own right. And the BBC reported, it was a fair election. Now, 2 years later at the parliamentary elections, which is obviously decide the Prime Minister and all the seats in their parliament, Yanukovych's party of regions won about 30% of the vote. They were the leaders. Tymoshenko's Fatherland Party won about 25% of the vote. Vitaly Klitschko's Udar Party, and we'll talk more about Klitschko later on, won about 15%, and then two other parties won 13% and 10% respectively, the latter of which was Ale Tyahnybok's Svoboda Party, and we'll talk more about that later. Now, of course, at this election, just like all elections in that part of the world, there are allegations of vote rigging and fraud, etc. And the US and the EU publicly announced disappointment and concern about the election process. But even their criticism seems to be pretty moderate. I mean, this, for all intents and purposes, was a fair election. It was recognised. This is what happened. 2004, Yanukovych gets elected. Then there's a big protest, largely fomented by America. A second round of elections. He loses out to Yushchenko. Fast forward 6 years. Yushchenko gets 5% of the vote. Yanukovych makes it to the second round of voting, and he wins outright. But everybody accepts this and moves on. 2 years later, at the parliamentary election in 2012, his party wins the most votes of any party. Okay, those are just the facts that anyone can verify for himself. Let's fast forward now. This is part 4. In late 2012, the tussle for Ukraine between the East and West heated up. Now, from the 1990s, Russia had been leading an effort with neighbouring nations to form its own type of free trade agreement called the Eurasian Customs Union. And the present member states are Russia, with a population of about 140 million, Kazakhstan with about 18 million people, and Belarus with about 10 million people. And these countries officially signed up to the agreement in 2009. By 2015, the nations of Armenia with 3 million people, Tajikistan with 8 million people, and Kyrgyzstan with 6 million people are expected to join the Greater Eurasian Economic Union. So in total, this is something like 180, 190 million people, which is still significantly less than the EU's roughly 500 million, and economically much, much less powerful. But the general idea of these sorts of agreements is to help improve trade and economic output. Now, in December 2012, the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the customs union, which I just referred to, was, quote, a move to re-Sovietize the region, end quote, and stated, quote, let's make no mistake about it. We know what the goal is, and we are trying to figure out effective ways to slow down or prevent it, end quote. So this is the US Secretary of State in late 2012 openly declaring that they want to stop Russia and her allies from integrating economically with each other. Just stating it openly. Now, fast forward to September 2013, and a lady named Victoria Nuland assumes the role of Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. That's the US Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. In September 2013, Victoria Nuland was appointed to that role, and that name will become very important as I go through this piece today and in part 2. Now, on November 21, 2013, the Yanukovych government suspended preparations for signing the associations agreement with the European Union. And this led to mass protests, which included the occupation of buildings. And these protests were essentially to last right up until the ousting of Yanukovych a few months later. It was later revealed that Putin had offered Yanukovych a much better deal to remain economically aligned with Russia than to go with the European Union. And that offer included a discount of 1/3 of the price of Russian gas, on which Ukraine relies, and a commitment to buy billions of dollars of Ukrainian government bonds at a time when the country was desperately in need of finance. In other words, we're going to slash the cost of your gas. If you stay aligned with us and the Eurasian Union, we'll slash the cost of gas by 1/3, and we will lend your government billions and billions of dollars. Yep. That was the offer from Putin, which was markedly better than the offer from the European Union. So naturally, Yanukovych went with the better offer. And again, I'll give all these links in the info box. Make up your own mind. See what was on the table and ask yourself what you would have done. So that was November 21. Now on November 21 was when Yanukovych government backed away from the associations agreement with Europe. Now on November 30, the police cracked down on the protesters who had assembled at Independence Square, or Maidan as we know it. And videos taken from within the camp showed that police clearly were brutal. There's no doubt about that in their attempts to disperse the crowd, as police tend to be when they're trying to disperse a crowd. Not to defend it at all, I'm just saying I do confirm, I've seen the video footage, they were brutal. And the Kiev Post described the crackdown as, quote, the most blatant and massive case of non-lethal police brutality in Ukraine in recent history, end quote. And that is the key point. It was non-lethal. Yes, it was brutal, and I would never support it. But they didn't actually kill anyone. They were just trying to clear the square, which had been occupied by protesters for over a week. Now, we've made this point on previous episodes of here before of the Australian Roundtable. How long do you think we would last if we tried to occupy Brisbane Square? Okay? Even if it wasn't G20, how long would we last? They would brutally get rid of us. I'm not supporting the Kiev police brutally bashing these people. And look, you see the footage, and they are overly brutal. Like, they use their batons and hit people in the dawn of the night. The thing is, let's not pretend for a second that our police wouldn't do the same thing. I'm against both groups doing it. If we're going to criticize the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian police response, which we should criticize, let's also keep in context our police do the same thing. Let's be equally critical, I say. But getting back to the timeline here, Kiev Post is Ukraine's English language newspaper. It's largely Western leaning and has long been critical of Yanukovych. Official numbers of the injured cited by the Kiev Post at these police crackdown was about 35 people. So the brutality had apparently injured, even according to the Kiev Post, about 3,000 people. We'll move on to, and that's still bad, by the way. Again, we're not supporting that at all. But that obviously escalated things. So we'll move on to part 5. The blatant attempt at revolution kicks in. Now, the next day, on December 1, after those police crackdowns, massive protests at Maiden were launched in response. And Svoboda, one of the opposition parties, took responsibility for the occupation of City Hall and Trade Union Building. So basically, they occupied the important buildings around Independence Square, and they said, we're taking responsibility for this now. We are occupying these buildings. We're not going to leave. Now, Svoboda's leader, Australian Roundtable, issued the following press release. Quote, "The revolution in 2004 was betrayed. This time, however, we must complete what has been started and have a total social and national revolution. We begin a national strike. A revolution has started in Ukraine. We created headquarters of the national resistance, which include political parties and public organizations. The main objective of the headquarters is to coordinate people on the Independence Square, which is the center of our resistance. In order to be effective, we must follow strict discipline and coordination rules. In the next 24 hours, similar headquarters should be created all over Ukraine. If you are acting alone, it is likely to end in failure. Any actions should be organized. As Maiden continues, a legitimate Kiev's authority has begun to form. Similarly, the House of Trade Unions has been under our control. We have to behave responsibly and stop playing games. Yanukovych's regime is a serious enemy. We must block and sabotage the work of the local councils, where most of the deputies are not patriots. We are starting to rock the boat of the regime. In order to oust this regime, we must lock the entire operation of the state." End quote. That was Australian Roundtable, whose party won about 10% of the vote at those parliamentary elections that I mentioned before. So this is the day after that protest was ended, with a few dozen people being injured. This is him stating clearly, this is revolution time now. Not, we're going to discuss this in Parliament. Not, we want an investigation and inquiry into the police. Now it's time for revolution. And you have to ask yourself, why would he be so confident that that would work? The day after police brutality of a few dozen people, why is he so confident? We'll get to that soon. Now, Yuri Lutsenko, who was a politician and an organizer of the Euromaidan protest, stated at the time, quote, "Our plan is clear. This is not a rally, not an action. This is a revolution." End quote. And Lutsenko is now the Minister for Internal Affairs under the current puppet President Petro Poroshenko, who I'll spend more time on in part 2. And as for Australian Roundtable, he is in Parliament now. He's in their executive government now. And again, we'll get to that next week. So that was December 1. All of that I just described was December 1 following the police crackdown. Let's fast forward now to December 13. Victoria Nuland made a speech. Again, she is the Assistant Secretary of State of European Affairs for the US. She made a speech at the US-Ukraine Foundation Conference, which you can see a video of, but I'll just read out a quick quote. "The Euromaidan movement has come to embody the principles and values that are the cornerstones for all free democracies. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous democratic Ukraine." End quote. So she even says herself, we've invested $5 billion through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, which I'll spend more time on next week, to promote democracy. But of course, by democracy, she means to promote them choosing to side with our team, which is, of course, the European Union. Now, 2 days later, on December 15, Senator John McCain was in Kiev, and he addressed the protesters at Maiden. Now, the night before his protest, he was interviewed by, I think it was a CNN, again, I'll link to in the info box. He was interviewed by a mainstream media outlet, and they asked him about it, and he said this, quote, "The message is that we believe the future of Ukraine lies in Europe. We've met with government officials and members of the opposition, and I look forward to visiting the square tomorrow. And I'm very proud of what the people of Ukraine are doing so that they can restore democracy to their country. We want a peaceful resolution which can be achieved through dialogue and at the same time make sure that every effort is made to make sure that Ukraine is aligned with Europe. That's, I think, the most important goal here. End quote. So let me just recap on that. Victoria Nuland states that the values that are taking place in Kiev, the storming and holding of buildings, and the call for revolution rather than democratic resolution is American values and democratic values, according to her. Good luck trying that in her country. And US Senator John McCain, who was a candidate to be their president, can you believe? I mean, I despise Obama. I mean, the whole political system is a sham, but you still can't help but wonder how much worse could it have been with McCain than Obama. It's all the same thing. I'm getting sidetracked here. But he's saying that he's very proud of what the people of Ukraine are doing, occupying their square and calling for a revolution. Now, what happened when people did that to occupy Wall Street? Well, they had plans to snipe them and kill them. And I mean, it's incredible. So anyway, at the Maidan, when he addressed the people at Maidan on a stage, he said, quote, "We're here to support your just cause and the sovereign right of Ukraine to determine its own destiny, freely and independently, and the destiny you seek lies in Europe," end quote. He said this when he was interviewed by a Western outlet after the Maidan speech, quote, "These people love the United States of America. They love freedom. And I don't think you could view this as anything other than our traditional support for people who want free and democratic society," end quote. And I wanted to include that one because at least here he's kind of being honest. I don't think you can view this as anything other than our traditional support for people who want free and democratic society. And if you look at the list of countries that they have toppled by using so-called democracy, he's being quite right. This is just another in a long list of countries that we've done this to. Moving on quickly now, on December 17, a couple of days later, Ukraine's Yanukovych and Russia's Putin signed the Ukrainian-Russian Action Plan, which was that deal that I mentioned earlier, the reason why he didn't take up Europe's offer. And as I said, it was a much better deal. Like, not even close. It wasn't even a contest. This was a much better deal for Ukraine economically. The protests continue and get stronger following this, and Maidan is completely controlled by what seems like up to tens of thousands of protesters. Opposition leaders vow to block Parliament. In other words, they're shutting down the actual democratic institutions now. They're not going to stop until they overthrow the government at this point. They vow to block the Parliament, and they end up doing that until anti-protest laws are passed, which I'll get to in just a moment. Now, the final nail in the coffin for anyone who's listening to this and still doesn't think that this was a US-led coup, the final nail in the coffin was the following. Victoria Nuland's phone call with the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, which was released, and its authenticity has never been denied. Now, the listener's been listening to me patiently for about 20 minutes now. I want to break that up a little bit by getting you two involved. Here is a transcript of that Nuland-Pyatt call. Here's one for you, Ethan. Here's one for you, Lindsay. Now, one of you has to play Victoria Nuland, and the other one gets to play Jeffrey Pyatt. And what we're going to do is spend a couple minutes. This is verbatim the conversation that was recorded and leaked between Victoria Nuland, the US Assistant Secretary of State, and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine. It was leaked in early February. We're not sure when the recording took place. It could have been a few weeks before. But what you two are about to play and read out is verbatim, word for word. Take it away, boys.
Okay, well, if the listeners will pretend that I've got a butch voice, can I be Newland?
So Lindsay's going to be Newland, and Ethan, you can be Jeffrey Pyatt.
Okay. It begins by saying, what do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as Deputy Prime Minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call you want to set up, is exactly the one made to Yats. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad that he said what he said in his response.
I'll just interject quickly. Yats is Arsene Yatsenyuk, and Klitsch is Vitali Klitschko. So back to you, Victoria Nuland.
Okay, good. I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I guess in terms of him not going into government, just let him stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead. We want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be
Tiani Bok, Ole Tiani Bok.
Tiani Bok and his guys, and I'm sure that's part of what
Yanukovych
is. I'll just call him Yats.
No, Yanukovych is different.
Oh man, is calculating on all this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's what he needs is Klitsch and Tiani Bok on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I think Klitsch going in there, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Do you want us to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting and that Yats was going to offer, in that context, a 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understand it?
No. That's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them, where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got, and he's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you a chance to move fast on all of this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
All right, thanks, boys. Now, in hindsight, we probably should have given that a practice run before we did it live. Can I say, Lindsay, I think there is a future for you in acting. Ethan, don't quit your day job. So obviously what we just listened to was the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, discussing who they wanted to install as the government once they officially got rid of Yanukovych's government. That's exactly what we just listened. There's no denying it, no debating it. Yeah. Verbatim what you guys just read out, apart from your inability to pronounce some of those words. That's actually the conversation. Yeah. People can listen to the real one if they check the link in the info box. There's no debate here. There's no... they didn't even deny this, the US State Department. This is exactly what happened. But when this call was leaked, what did the mainstream media focus on? The fact that Victoria Nuland had said, fuck the EU. You might remember that got a fair bit of coverage in the media. Now, she did say that in the call, but that wasn't the important part. Like, that's just someone, expressing frustration or something, whatever. That was not the important part, but that's what most people read about, and we've probably already forgotten about. But what was really interesting was what happened elsewhere in the conversation, where they discuss who they want to go into the government after they get rid of Yanukovych. Now, in next week's part, I'll discuss that final couple of weeks where the so-called protesters were shooting police and Yanukovych did eventually flee the country. And, of course, following that, the Arsen Yatseniuk was finally installed as the Prime Minister. Of course, Yanukovych was the president. Someone else replaced him. Arsen Yatseniuk was installed as the Prime Minister. But ultimately, the US got what they wanted, Arsen Yatseniuk in a position of power. And I'll go into more detail about that next week. But right now, I just want to finish this little segment of part one by focusing on the anti-protest laws that were passed by Yanukovych, by the government under Yanukovych on January 16, which was seized upon by the Western media and the Maidan protesters as the final excuse to do what they were going to do anyway, which was to oust the government. Now, on January 16, so-called anti-protest laws were passed after Maidan had been occupied by protesters for almost 2 months, and many government buildings had been occupied, so Parliament was struggling to operate in any way, shape or form. And as I said, the Western media sees on these laws as being dictatorial. And from this point, Yanukovych's days were numbered, if they weren't already, which of course they were. Now, here is some of the Western coverage of those laws that were passed on January 16 from the BBC. Quote, on Thursday, MPs from Mr. Yanukovych's party of the regions, together with the Communists and a number of independents, passed the laws amid scenes of chaos in Parliament. One of the laws bans any unauthorised installation of tents, stages, or amplifiers in public places. Those who violate the law now face a hefty fine or detention. Protests involving more than 5 vehicles in auto-Maidan motorcades were also banned. This followed such demonstrations outside government offices, including Mr. Yanukovych's countryside residence, in recent days, end quote. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment, but just note that they banned the unauthorised installation of tents, stages, and amplifiers. Where have you heard that? You can't protest in more than 5 vehicles. Well, in Australia, here in Queensland, you can't even have more than 3 bikies together without the risk of being imprisoned under VLAD laws.
Yeah.
They're just saying you can't have more than 5 cars trying to block government offices. All right, that was from the BBC. Let's check out what The Guardian said about these laws. Quote, the new laws ban any unauthorised installation of tents, stages, amplifiers. We've already gone over that. People and organisations who provide facilities or equipment for such meetings will also be liable to a fine or detention. Apart from targeting public protests, the laws are also similar to Russia's on registration of foreign non-government organisations, categorising them as foreign agents if they are funded from abroad, end quote. So in other words, the law has said, if you're being funded by another country, well, you have to be registered now, which seems an entirely reasonable thing to do. Now from Reuters, again, this is covering these laws on January 16. From Reuters, quote, the law, backed by 235 of 450 lawmakers, said unauthorised installation of 10 stages, we've gone over that, a fine of up to $640 or up to 15 days in detention. People and organisations who provide facilities or equipment were liable to a fine of up to $1,200 or detention of up to 10 days. Opposition politicians regularly use a stage in the square to broadcast messages of support to the protesters. And the law, assuming it is signed into force by Yanukovych, would clearly make such action illegal. The law would make it an offence punishable up to 15 days detention to wear a mask or face covering like that adopted by many protesters, particularly those from nationalist parties, end quote. So take a note of that. If you break this law, laws that are similar to what we have in Australia, you face a fine of up to 1.2 grand or detention of up to 2 days. Compare that with the protests in Ukraine. And now this is protesters trying to stop government. This is basically revolution. They're saying if you're a revolution doing this, we're going to fine you a grand or 2 and detain you for up to 10 days. Compare that to what's happening to Tasmanians in Australia right now, where if they chain themselves to a tree, it's a $10,000 on-the-spot fine, and if they repeat offend, they can be imprisoned for up to 4 years. Are you hearing me here?
Yeah.
These were the so-called they were anti-protest laws. I don't support them at all. But compare them to what happens in this country, right? These were the ones that were passed on January 16. Now, the US State Department, in response to those laws, issued the following press release. I'll read it out in verbatim, and then we'll almost be finished with this segment. Quote, the United States expresses its deep concern that the Ukrainian Rada, which is their parliament, pushed through several controversial measures today without adhering to proper procedures. Some of these measures will restrict the right to peacefully protest and exercise the freedom of speech, constrain independent media, and inhibit the operation of NGOs. If Ukraine truly aspires to a European future, it must defend and advance universal democratic principles and values that underpin a Europe whole, free and at peace, and not allow them to be systematically dismantled. End quote. I just have to stop there. This is hard for me to read with a straight face. It really is. I'm going to finish with this last paragraph. Quote, we call on the government of Ukraine to ensure its legislation reflects Ukraine's democratic commitments to the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the wishes of its people to exercise their fundamental freedoms of speech, assembly, and association. Both the process and the substance of the Rada's actions today cast serious doubt on Ukraine's commitment to democratic norms. A true democracy cannot function without dialogue, compromise, the right to peaceful dissent, and a legislature that enjoys the people's trust. End quote. That is a verbatim quote from the US State Department following those anti-protest laws that I just discussed. So here's my shout out to the US State Department right now. Here in Brisbane, Australia, we need your help.
Exactly.
Come and help us, guys. Now, that's part 1 of the Ukrainian piece that I've been wanting to do for a while. In part 2 of the piece, I'll discuss the February armed coup that finally got rid of Yanukovych and who was involved, the leaked phone call involving the Estonian foreign minister, which confirmed that agents provocateurs were involved in the coup and were shooting innocent protesters, the puppets who were installed following the coup and what they've achieved since, the annexation of Crimea by Russia in response to all of this, the shooting down of the MH17, Western and particularly Australian coverage of these events, and the best part that I'm looking forward to the most, the relationship between Victoria Nuland, Senator John Kerry, the US State Department, and Yale University, and its relationship to the events leading up to and following 9/11. So if you've liked that first segment, you haven't heard anything yet, because things get really interesting when you look at all of the relations that are involved. But just to recap on part 1, if I can, and just bear with me while I go back a few pages here. There are a lot of notes here. I apologise again for how long this segment is taking, but this is very important, guys. It's important to the entire geopolitical atmosphere that we find ourselves in right now. And it's also important to understand how media manipulates what they call protests and democracy. So again, just recapping, the Orange Revolution in 2004, the US doesn't like the election result. They foment a revolution. Yushchenko gets elected. At the next presidential election, he gets none of the vote. Yanukovych is elected, and this time people accept it. Doesn't want to side with Europe, wants to side with Russia, understandably so, given what was involved. Protests take hold of Maidan. He passes laws to stop them from stopping everyone else from using Maidan. The police are heavy-handed, but no more so than they would be here in Australia if we did the same thing. Although our police would do it after one night, his did it after weeks. Then the protests really start, and eventually Yanukovych is ousted, and the US State Department is caught out plotting the entire coup. That's the recap, guys, and I know you've been very patient, and thanks to all the listeners for sitting there. Based on what you've just heard, what are your thoughts?
Well, to me, it's no surprise. We were talking about this. We were talking about CIA in Australia last week, and it's just the same thing over and over. I mean, we could go through Iran with what was the Shah of Iran?
Yeah.
It just goes on and on and on, and they haven't learnt yet that people do get sick of this sort of thing, and we're not all that stupid. Eventually, we finally wake up that this is the way they operate. Maybe that doesn't worry them. They just don't care what we think. They think they're tough enough and they're going to tough it out.
Basically, the way it works is if they can install a coup, but they control the media so well that the masses don't even know, they'll do it. See Australia 1975. If they can plot a coup, but they have to be more overt in what they do by funding so-called protesting groups, they'll do that. See Ukraine 2004, see Ukraine 2014. If they have to go one step further and assassinate people, they'll do that too. See the Shah of Iran. I mean, this should not come as news. I mean, Ukraine, not many people know about because media doesn't cover it, but the general idea of the US plotting to take out governments they don't like, if this is news to you, please, I insist, just go and study some history because it's all there. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't out there views on what is taking place. This is explicitly what they do. Ethan.
Yeah. I think it's just a recurring thing, and you just look through history, and it's just completely provable. You know, they've just been ousted in the phone call. You know, all of this evidence is suggested, and I know that's what I'm looking forward to next week, is you getting into some of the media coverage from the MH17 flight and some of the correlations it has with just how well the media can keep people controlled so they don't know about this. Yeah. It happens all throughout history. It's a common thing. If you wanted to do the math, it's mathematically probably likely that the US government's going to overthrow countries and that they've overthrown more countries than etc. And yet people still don't know about it.
Yeah, and I said that this is really important because it says a lot about the current geopolitical atmosphere of what's taking place in the world. It's also so instructive on how what we're told about democracy and how free they tell us we are is utterly ridiculous. 36 protesters getting bashed or getting injured after having occupied a square for a few weeks is a good enough reason for the US State Department, people like Senator John McCain and Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, to say we support the protesters, we have to oust this government, whatever. That's a good enough justification there. But look at the laws here. You chain yourself to a tree and you're liable, if you've done it before, it's up to 4 years in prison. Yeah. And they try and tell us that we're the free ones and that people like Yanukovych are the corrupt ones. I said this last week, when you fully grasp the Orwellian world that we live in here, it can take a few weeks, months, or even years to fully accept and internalize the fact that this is just like Orwell's 1984. We are being lied to about our own government and about other governments, and all you have to do is look at the facts for themselves to realize this. It's as simple as that. Now, I tell you what, we've gone to an hour and 48. I say we go through the full 2 hours and get in these last couple of segments. I like round numbers, Ethan. What do you reckon? Shall we go to 2 hours? Lindsay, are you with me?
Yeah.
That's
still daylight.
That's enough about Ukraine part 1. For now, I'll get to part 2 whenever the chance comes up. It probably won't on Sunday next week because we'll be doing a big wrap on the whole G20. Yeah. Maybe the week after that, or whenever the time permits. But look forward to that one. Now, moving on, Lindsay, I know you've got some things to talk about with Alan Greenspan, the former US Federal Reserve Chairman, and his comments about money.
Yeah, I picked this up during the week. It's only very small. I'll just read it out. The background to it is that it wasn't that long ago. We were being told that gold was some sort of relic from the past and it had no value really. It was just a commodity. And I know we've got an ex-Prime Minister, Keating, when he was in power, was selling Australia's gold off. And we were led to believe that, it's all passé. We don't need this anymore. And then this came from Zero Hedge. For some reason, the Council of Foreign Relations, where ex-Fed Chief Alan Greenspan spoke last week, decided the following discussion should be left out of the official transcript. We can perhaps understand why, as Gillian Tett concludes, I think she might be a reporter, comments like that will be turning you into a rock star among the gold bug community. And this is the question and the answer. Apparently Tett put to Greenspan, do you think that gold is currently a good investment? And Greenspan said, yes. Remember what we're looking at. Gold is a currency. It is still, by all evidence, a premier currency. No fiat currency, including the dollar, can match it. Now, that pretty much says it all. That's completely turned on the head of what they were saying before. And I can't quote him saying that, but I presume he would have been amongst the crew that were denigrating gold. And it just, to me, it just opened up, and I thought, well, he probably had to come to this conclusion because the Chinese aren't succumbing to this BS that's in the mainstream media. They're buying gold, Russians, Chinese, Indians, they're buying gold like it's going out of fashion. So finally somebody's had to come out and admit, well, they're not that stupid. Maybe they know what they're doing. And I think I'm trying to think who it was now who made that point about the golden rule, is that he who's got the gold makes the rules.
Yeah.
And I think that pretty much sums it up. And we'll see. Anyway, it'll pan out in the long term. It won't take very long now. We're just about at the end of the fiat currency run, I think, the way they're building trillions of dollars.
You look at it, when Obama was elected, the US debt was something like $8 trillion. Their official debt. This doesn't include other liabilities. This is just their official government debt. It was something like $8 trillion. And now it's close to double that. And Obama, it's like $17 trillion last I checked. Obama hasn't even finished his term yet. So in the space of one presidential period of office, it will have more than doubled. It's going exponential. So we are in the final days of the fiat currency. Whether they can continue the printing press for another 10 years remains to be seen. But there's no question that we are in the final days of the US dollar. Yeah. And that's why I'm happy to take the show out to 2 hours to discuss this, because money and the creation of money and the monopoly of the creation of money is at the heart of everything. Yeah. It's like they say, all wars are bankers' wars. What do you reckon, Nathan?
Yep, I agree. I agree that the current economic system is just bound. It's just bound. The US dollar is just bound. I'm surprised that they've continued it on for as long as they have. They've stretched it out. I made the analogy that it's like a hungover medical student trying to get through his test at school, just trying to get that pass, just dragging it on for as long as he can to try and meet the word count. And I'm just surprised it lasted as long, because there was a lot of signs saying that it was going to collapse multiple times. But it's coming to an end, and it's ironic how all of these push for World War III and everything is happening at the same time as we've talked about. Yeah,
I'm just sitting here wondering, Lindsay, they took. Nixon, I think it was, took America off the gold standard back in 1971 from memory. I don't have notes in front of me. I think it was 1971. It was meant to be temporarily taking them off the gold standard. Of course, there was nothing temporary about it. I'm just trying to think, you would have been a young man at the time, possibly too young to appreciate the consequences of what was happening.
I've got documents at home about the 1933, when they actually confiscated all gold and all gold certificates and whatever. Yep. That was in the US. And they did it here, but they didn't make a song and dance about it here like they did over there. There's a High Court decision I've got at home somewhere where they gradually, surreptitiously did it. Anyway, I'll get back to something on that in a minute. But then I think it was Nixon, was it? It was silver. I think they finally took silver off as well in the 70s.
Well, what's fascinating is if you look at the video, because it's available on YouTube, of Nixon making a public speech about temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar. And if you buy American goods, your life will go on as normal, and all this nonsense. And of course, we know now, 40 years later, there was nothing temporary about it. And it was never going to be anything temporary about it. They printed too many dollars to fund the Vietnam War. Yeah. And none of this is by accident. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, they know what they're doing. Right. Well, they destroyed Russia. I knew, you hear all about the German hyperinflation back in 24 or whenever it was. Yeah. But I just read something the other day, and they were talking about the Russian hyperinflation just before that. And I'd never heard of that before. And apparently it was the same mob that financed the revolution in Russia, destroyed the Russian currency. Yeah. And it's just that they know what they're doing. anyway.
Well, I know this is one of your favourite topics. I'm glad it is because, like I said, it's fundamental to everything. We'll make sure that after the G20, assuming that we're all still free men to do what we want, we'll make sure we set aside an episode sometime after G20 to make a big feature piece on money, and hopefully you can bring, because I know you have lots of resources to discuss this, bring them along. We'll do a full show on the topic of money. But we'll leave it there for now because time is running short. I wanted to quickly talk about how marijuana was legalised in a couple more states in the US at the recent midterm elections because they hold their plebiscites at the same time as the midterms. I don't care who won or lost out, the Democrats and Republicans. It's all the same. But what was interesting was that Oregon legalised marijuana, Washington, D.C. legalised it, and one of the places whose name escapes me. So what this means is that we're now up to 5 or 6 states in the US where marijuana is legal, not just decriminalised. Legal, you can buy it from a shop. Don't have time to talk about it today because we are out of time, but I'll spend some time in one of the future episodes talking about that. And also an update on Canada. More great work being done by people like Free Radio Revolution and the Auto Expositor, exposing the complete fraud that was the shooting there. I know that news moves fast these days and many of our listeners have probably moved on, but this is huge what happened in Canada. They were caught, like in Australia, when they had our false flag here to justify all of this, they didn't release any evidence. We can't prove it's all wrong. We can just say, hey, why is there no evidence? In Canada, they released evidence and it's all completely bogus. It's been completely exposed. Again, check out the links in the info box for that. Don't have time to discuss more about Canada today, but we'll go into more detail in a future episode. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, boys. We'll move on to our final thoughts and we'll wrap it up. We'll start with you, Ethan, because you've been quiet for the last few minutes. I think you need a coffee just quietly. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Just in general, I was going to mention to you too that this could be one of the last weeks that Brisbane remains like this. You know, who knows what could happen at the G20? Things could get shaken up pretty badly, and we could, you know, for some of our international listeners out there, and for even some of our domestic that don't realise this, our city slogan in Brisbane is Australia's New World City.
Yeah, I didn't know that till you pointed that out to me, and that is very eerie.
It's very eerie. So if you think about that and you think of everything that we've talked about through all of our catalogue of episodes, just seems like things could, you know, soon not be the way that they are, and that's something that I've wanted to point across in my final thoughts. Do you want to take
the liberty? We do have a minute or two. Do you want to speculate here in our, because our final thoughts segment we can be a bit more free. Everything else we try and have our facts and we can verify everything. So let's have some speculation now, Ethan. Do you want to say what you think might take place, you know, under the pretext of G20?
From the beginning of the year, before all of these laws were introduced, before ISIS came onto the scene as the boogeyman, the bikies were still the boogeyman here at the time. I just had a personal feeling, seeing how everything was going, seeing towards how everything is going. And I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but I really think that if there was a catalyst to pull off some sort of a major false flag attack, it would be perfect for them to do it at the G20, because we've talked about how Canada have done these, these shootings, introduced legislation, happened in Australia first. Everything is happening within Australia first. We are being the test dummy for all of these things. Ginger Jihadi is now high-ranking in ISIS. Australia is becoming related to all of these world events. Now with all the leaders here, it's the perfect catalyst for something like that. And even if a false flag attack doesn't happen, which I hope it doesn't, but that's something that I've just felt and told everyone before all of this happened, before ISIS came up and everything, I still think it'll be the catalyst for when we can look back. We won't realise it at first, but we can look back and say that's when the police state started in Australia.
And the reason why I'm not really receptive to these kinds of prophecies of doom, but the reason why I'm receptive to this one is because following the Boston bombings, one of the crisis actors involved in that false flag was doing the rounds on Australian television, and on a couple of different interviews, he stated, it happened in Boston, it can happen in Brisbane. And Brisbane is our third largest city. Why is he specifically saying Brisbane? Is it just because of the alliteration? You know, Boston, Brisbane? Is it just because of that? The thing is, he said it twice, so it's clearly scripted. So is it for alliterative effect, or is it because of something else? I don't know. I'm not saying anything will happen, neither you, Ethan, but we're speculating.
Yeah.
You never know.
I'd never heard that before.
I like to usually go off of facts and whatnot, because I'm a proper journalist that doesn't report in the Courier Mail. But from a personal opinion, that's really what I feel, and I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, no, I hope you're wrong too. It just reminded me of Port Arthur. I mean, it's probably out of the mind of people where the massacre in Port Arthur with 35 people shot, and there were people predicting if we don't get rid of guns, there will be a massacre in Port Arthur. And lo and behold, it happened.
Sure, it certainly was.
And then I've tried to find the newspaper records for that, and they've all redacted out of the library.
Down the memory hole, Lindsay.
Yeah, you can't get them from the library.
Now, try and wrap up quickly. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, none at all, because I really don't know what's going to happen. We'll wait and see.
Wait and see. All right, I just want to, for my little piece, I just want to say a huge thanks to 49 and Brian Roberts of the Mass Resistance Roundtable for having me on the show last week. It was a terrific experience. They've invited me back on for next week, so that'll be Tuesday night American time, Wednesday morning Australian time. I'll be back on the Mass Resistance Roundtable. Again, the link will be in the info box underneath this video. And I've also been invited on We'll Do It Live, which is Free Radio Revolution and Red Pill Revolution's live show, which will be Wednesday night American time, Thursday morning Australian time. Again, it'll be broadcast live. If you can't listen live, it'll be uploaded just like it always is. Mass Resistance and We'll Do It Live, they're really leading the charge of the genuine alternative media. And it was because of them that I wanted to do this show. So if you're a listener who only knows Australian Roundtable, please go and check out their show. They're a little bit less structured than we are, but they're probably a little bit more fun and colourful. So I think it's good to have a mix. We try and be structured here and run off, not scripted, but to have our notes in front of us and to have facts that we can refer back to. They're a lot more off the cuff. I think it's good to have a mix of the two. So check those out. That's the Mass Resistance Roundtable and the We'll Do It Live podcast. I'll be on both of those next week. And just finally, obviously, we're doing a few live shows next week. I'm hoping to do live shows on Friday night and the Saturday night and the Sunday night. I'm hoping you two will both join me. Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't promise when these shows will happen. It's dependent on two major factors: what we're doing and whether we're under detention, which hopefully we won't be, and we're going to try not to be, but you can never know. And two, what's actually happening. I mean, if Saturday night is as big as I think it is, we could spend a lot of time there. We might not get back in time to do the show. So listeners, keep an eye out. We'll try and let you know once we know when those shows will be. But if you can't listen live, they'll be uploaded to our channel, just like they always are. Now, it's been a long show, boys. I want to thank all the listeners for listening to the whole show. Thanks to you two both being able to stick it out for 2 hours in this very hot room. We have to close up the windows of the studio to keep out the noise, especially when there are military choppers flying all around. So we're all tired. Thank you for the patience of the listeners. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for coming in.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Lindsay, Ethan, once again, thank you for coming in and for all of your work. And we'll catch all the listeners at whenever our next live show will be, which could be in a few days' time. And if you don't hear from us again, it's been an absolute pleasure bringing you guys the Australian Roundtable podcast.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.